Hey, mushroom lovers. I am being joined today by Lori Rice, who is the founder of Fake Food Free Productions and Creating You online courses. She's a food photographer and writer working with food brands, agricultural boards, and publishers. She is a photographer and author of two of her own cookbooks. Today, she's going to join us to talk all about creating recipes for your customers, which will help you sell more mushrooms. Lori, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Lori, talk to us a little bit about your history with mushrooms, because you've been working with mushrooms for a while now.
I have one of my favorite clients is the Mushroom Council.
Mm.
And I've gotten to do a lot of different things with them, including recipe development and photography, but I've also traveled with them a bit for food media tours. And so that's been a lot of fun. And I've been able through that to connect with mushroom growers and learn a bit more about the industry and all of that, which and the practices, which I find really interesting, even though I don't necessarily do it myself, grow them. But it's been a really great projects with mushrooms. I love mushrooms, so it works out really well.
Cool. What are some of the cool varieties that you've seen when you've been working with them?
So I think, of course, maitake, hen of the woods, those are probably my favorite. I've worked with trumpet mushrooms and oyster mushrooms and shiitakes, common varieties like white button as well, but there are some, I guess, less common delicious varieties as well.
Have you done any time lapses with the mushrooms and seen them actually like bloom?
I've watched those, but I've never, seen or created how that's created. Yeah, that's really interesting.
All right, well, let's dive into it because I know there's so much that people can get out of working and creating their own recipes.
Okay, so as Michael said, we're going to talk about writing mushroom recipes. And through this, I just want to talk about those tips that are going to help you turn those cooking ideas that you have, those things that you're making in your own kitchen that help your mushrooms taste delicious. I want to help you translate those into something that's going to be usable for your customers. But what we're going to talk about today is the most effective way to turn your cooking ideas into those recipes. And the idea is that you want your customers to be able to successfully recreate it. And that is going to help them to enjoy your mushrooms in the best way possible, to help them bring out the best flavors, have the best flavor pairings. And then ultimately, that means that they're going to buy more mushrooms for you. They'll be more adventurous with trying new varieties if they have a trusted way and that they understand how to prepare them the best way possible. So the goal that we have here is an easy to follow, repeatable recipe. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be super quick and easy. They can have multiple steps. They can be a little bit more complex. You'll know your audience. You may want to offer more complex recipes and simple recipes to reach a broader audience. But the idea is, regardless of how complex those recipes are, they are easy to follow and your customer can make them themselves in their home kitchen. So the risk of a failed recipe is, and failed would be one that is not easy to understand. It's not easy to understand how to make it. The recipe isn't written well, and it's not repeatable for your customer. The risk of that is that, believe it or not, general consumers aren't going to blame themselves if a recipe goes wrong. And they're probably not even going to blame you or the person who wrote the recipe. They're going to blame the mushroom. They're going to think, I don't like that variety. It doesn't taste good, just because maybe the recipe didn't translate well. And we don't want them to think that. We want them to think they're delicious. So we don't want to have that risk of a failed recipe. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that we have repeatable recipes that people can successfully make at home? Well, the very first step with that is accurate documentation. You want to record all of the details of your recipe. So that means when you're just in your kitchen and maybe it's a recipe that's been passed down by your family and you have a sketch of the things that go into it. I have a lot of those from my grandmother that those measurements and steps aren't exact. Or maybe you're just cooking and you're good at cooking and you're throwing things in. but you want to document every part of this so that you can then write it into a recipe that someone else can make. So it starts with the measurements and thinking about, are you using volume and the correct measuring cup for volume? You want to make sure that you stick with, measurements that you're used to seeing in recipes, half a cup, third of a cup. You kind of want to avoid those extra things like 1 cup plus 1 tablespoon. It's not awful to have those, but it just makes things a little bit more confusing. So try to narrow that down and make them very specific. Your cooking times become important. So someone needs to know how long those mushrooms are cooking. Is it 3 minutes? Is it 5 minutes? You want to make sure you can have ranges there because everyone's going to have a little bit of room for error with their temperatures and their personal practices with cooking. But you want to make sure that you're pretty close so that they know what they're doing in the recipe. And then, of course, temperatures. When it comes to burners, you want to put, is it medium, high heat? Is it high heat? That kind of thing. And then also oven temperatures as well, making sure that those are correct whenever, and marking those down whenever you're baking things. And one thing that I don't have listed here that I'll add in right now is, size of vessels, like pots and pans and casserole dishes and things like that. Like, what are we looking at that they need to cook this particular step in? You want to give them that guidance. And then another thing that you want to add that's often overlooked is visual cues. So with high quality recipe writing, you want to include both time and visual cues, because as I said before, people will, their temperature won't be spot on, or they do something a little bit differently. So their 5 to 7 minutes may not be spot on with your 5 to 7 minutes. So you want to let them know the edges are brown, things are translucent, they've softened. If it's something that's baked, the toothpick comes out clean. Things that they can visually see that the recipe is at the point that it needs to be so that they can move on to the next step. Now, along with accurate documentation, we want consistency. Now, what this means is this is just consistency for you and the recipes that your business or farm are putting out. That means it doesn't matter if you use T period or TSP period for tablespoon and teaspoon, or you spell it all out. I have different recipe writing rules, so to speak, for all of the clients that I work for. But what's important is all of their recipes are exactly the same. So you can make that decision for yourself. In current trends, most of the time writing things out like ounces and teaspoons, even though it does take up more space if you're printing like recipe cards, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, it is helpful for a consumer that may have, may be inexperienced with cooking. So there's no confusion there for what that means. So just make sure you have that consistency and you're doing the same thing each time.
Okay, Laura, you're going to have to go back one slide. What was the picture of in that picture?
Okay, so that is from my newest cookbook, Beer Bread, and that is a savory, what I'm calling a savory coffee cake. So it's kind of a focaccia base, and then it's mushrooms and goat cheese.
Oh, that sounds really good.
And it's made with beer. I have to go back and see which beer, but in Beer Bread, all of those bread bases were made with beer. Yeah.
Very cool.
Next, we want to write logical recipes. And so you'll hear terms, well-written recipe or good recipe or whatever the case may be. But really what it comes down is logic. How are we cooking this recipe? That's how we want to write it so that someone else can do the same thing. So let's talk about what the components of a logical recipe are. And I'm going to show you some examples after I go through these. But first of all, you want to have a head note. And the thing about the head note, this is just the little paragraph that you're going to see before a recipe. The thing about a head note is you don't necessarily just want to repeat what ingredients are in this dish. The purpose of the head note is that it provides supportive information. It educates the consumer and it maybe offers new ideas. So you can talk about substitutions if they can't find something. For mushrooms, you might talk about different varieties that you have and what mushrooms could you substitute here. You educate them a little bit. Tell a story about how this recipe came to be for your brand or farm, and then offer ideas, eat it with this, serve it with that. That's what the head note is really for. And it doesn't have to be a long head note, but it's a fun way to give them more information about you and your company. Servings or amounts make sense. So a lot of servings for recipes are based on dietetics and nutritionists and making sure that those servings fit a nutritional criteria. So that you've seen recipes where it's like 6 servings and you're like, oh, my husband and I ate all of that in one. Like that exists. So for a general consumer, I think you should be true to what those servings really are for you. If the nutritional side is not a huge concern. You're not a dietitian or something like that where you're trying to create recipes like that. So just make sure they make sense and they're accurate. It's an amount that's going to fill someone up, because then people build trust with those kind of recipes, right? So then you also want to make sure that, is it servings or is it maybe an amount? Salad dressings and things like that, it's fine to put makes 1 cup. You don't have to put that in servings. And then your preparation and your cooking times make sense. Now, this is one area that I find to be a little bit debatable, because you're going to see in the recipes that I show you that were in my book, we didn't include preparation and cooking times. Not everyone does that. And it can be helpful, because some people do look at it and they think, how long is this going to take? Like, is there an hour of marination time? But there is a way to put that in the head note and to look at a list of ingredients and know that this is either a simple or a complex recipe. And everyone cooks a little bit differently. So my 10 minutes of prep, because I cook so much, could be your or someone else's 20 minutes of prep, because they're not as experienced. So those terms are kind of relative, but if you want to add them, some of my clients do require them. So put the preparation time, and that is everything that you're pulling together. How long did it take you to chop, measure, and all of that? And then you'll have your cooking or your baking time. So how long was it in the oven? And if you have a range on those, say it was 25 and you want to add that up. If you cooked 5 minutes in a skillet and then later it cooks 10 minutes, you add that up and then go with the highest number in that range. So if it was 25 to 30 minutes, put 30 minutes. Now, ingredients. This is going to be the one thing that you always catch in recipes that aren't well written. And that is that the ingredients are listed in the order that they are added to the recipe. So everything is very step by step. Your ingredients match your preparation. So if olive oil was the very first thing you put in the pan, that is your very first ingredient. It doesn't matter how much it is. Now, if the order is flexible and maybe you threw a couple things in the pan at the same time, which happens when we're cooking, you want to go largest volume to smallest volume. And then if the volumes are the same, say you have a 1/4 teaspoon of fine ground sea salt and you have a 1/4 teaspoon of ground black pepper, then it defaults to ABC order. So that fine sea salt would go first, ground pepper would go second. So order they're listed, then largest to smallest is your second default, then ABC order is the third default. Now, when it comes to preparation instructions, you have a little bit of flexibility here because you can put in a bit of your character in the way that you write here, but there are some rules with preparation steps. The first is that you want them to be actionable. So I'll show you in the example here in just a second that you want to use action verbs when you start the preparation step. Now, you will see in a lot of recipes, and it's totally okay, but this was something that I kind of broke myself of whenever I wrote my book because of the requirements that I had, is that, in a small bowl, comma, whisk this and this and this. Take that to whisk this and this and this in a small bowl, because you want people to look, when they go through that recipe, they see action, 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 as opposed to it reading like a paragraph and taking them longer to get through it. So think about moving action verbs to the beginning. You want those preparation steps obviously to be in order from the time that from the ingredients that you're placing as well. So those need to match up. And then you want it to make sense with the flow of cooking. So that is why when you see baked recipes, it's preheat the oven first, grease the pan, and then you move on to making whatever it is that is going to go in the oven so that your oven can preheat while you are preparing the items to go in it. Now, it doesn't make sense if you have, let's just say, a chicken recipe as an example, and you tell them to preheat the oven at 400, then you prepare the marinade and the chicken has to sit for an hour. So think about what is happening. It's just a very logical thing. Like, what would you be doing next? So in that case, you would prepare the marinade, let the chicken sit, and then tell them to preheat the oven. And one exception to that whole, I said, in a bowl, whisk this, is a lot of times you will start with, while that is marinating or while that is cooking, move on to the next step. Those are steps. They don't start with action verbs, but they tell you what you can be doing while another step of the recipe is going on. Again, be sure to provide both time and visual cues. So you want them to know what the time is it's supposed to cook, but then what is it supposed to look like? And then do not be vague. And my favorite example of vague is cook until done, because that is in so many recipes. And I have to tell you all, so I get a lot of recipes from my ag clients that were previously developed by chefs, and they're delicious. But there is no way that a consumer could make those in their kitchen. And my job is to translate those and make them usable. So that those kinds of things are in there often, cook until done, because they all know what done means, but we don't know what done means. So make sure you're saying, is it, again, I'm using chicken as an example, but what is the internal temperature? What does it look like? How long has it been in the oven? Okay, now just a couple examples. So these are just actual screenshots that came from my first cookbook, just to kind of show you what these look like. And so with the head note here, I talk about, this is the cabbage salad that it kind of mimics a Reuben sandwich. That's how I got the idea. So I talk about, Reuben is my favorite. And then again, my first cookbook was cooking with craft beer. So all about beer here, but I talk about what the IPA adds to it, and not just that, hey, there's IPA in this. And then I talk about suggestions, like corned beef is hard to find outside of the month of March in some places. So that's why I use pastrami here. So you explain some things along the way. So there's the head note. And then the ingredients are pretty simple in this one. So I'll talk about the preparation steps. If you have super simple, like not many steps, it's totally fine just to put those into one paragraph, especially if you're trying to fit it onto a page or a recipe card. When there are more steps, which is what I'll show you here in just a second, you need to break those up for the eye, and so that someone doesn't miss something along the way. So this other recipe, again, with a head note, more suggestions for serving, what to have alongside of it. With the ingredients, they're going to appear as they were used in the recipe. And then here we have a lot more steps. And you can see the second that you look at this recipe, preheat, add, pour, transfer, bake. That's why we do that, is because, and then garnish is on there too, even though it's with that last step. As you go through, you see right away what you're going to be doing. And then another thing to think about are notes that you want to add. Now, notes can always go up in the head note if you prefer to have them up there. Sometimes it goes both ways. It's totally fine. But for example, with this particular recipe, you can bake it in a larger portion where everyone's taking the appetizer out of it, or you can bake it in very small ramekins and have individual portions. But what's going to happen is the baking time is going to be different. So that's why we point out those kind of notes to folks when we do that. Now, I do just want to touch on, if this just feels like so much work to put all of this into, something usable for your customers, there are other things you can do that you might find simpler. So cooking tips, how to cook with mushrooms, just general sheet about, what's the best way? What is it about mushrooms? Their moisture content and things like that you should be cooking them like this, but not like that. Those kinds of things can be very helpful, and things that they can apply to all of the kind of mushrooms that they're going to be buying from you. And then cooking ideas. So just general things like add these mushrooms to your omelet or to your pizza, whatever it might be. Just give them suggestions for how they could use them in the things that they are already making at home. And then flavor notes. I like flavor notes so that people better understand what that mushroom is going to taste like. And then what is it best paired with? Like, this would be great on an arugula salad, or this would be great, mixed into your bread dough and baked into a bread. Those kinds of things, the flavor pairings really help people. So those are options. They don't all have to be, you can educate your consumers and help them cook your mushrooms without just giving them recipes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit about getting those recipes into the hands of your consumers. So first of all, recipe cards, right? We've all seen those. If you can include an image, it's ideal. If you don't have an image of like the finished recipe and you don't want to bother with that, one idea that I really like is to have an image of the mushrooms that you are using in that recipe. And for all of the recipes that you've written that use that type of mushroom, use that mushroom image on the back, and then you have a category of this type. These are all made with maitakes or whatever it might be. You can print postcards, single or double-sided. This is fairly easy to do now, even with just like, usual print services, around the holiday season, you have your Christmas cards and things like that. You can even use tools like that to put your recipes on and create those and print them really inexpensively. And then of course there's business services that do this as well. This is just an example. The National Onion Association was a longtime client of mine. When my first cookbook came out, I had both a caramelized onion and mushroom recipe. And so they used it we partnered and they used it to help market both my book and caramelized onions and how to make caramelized onions. So this is just, name on the side, recipe. They have the image from my book, and then they went a bit further and they talked about more serving ideas for caramelized onions. So that could be more ideas for these mushrooms in your case. So more ideas. Recipe cards we talked about, you can do front and back, recipe on one side, image on the other.
I've got these.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, exactly.
They're actually from it's a company that was selling like a tomato, some sort of tomato jams, tomato preserve.
Oh yeah.
Beautiful pictures of tomatoes on the front.
Yeah.
On the back, they just have a fun recipe, which is using the product, which is really simple. But
that's a perfect example. Yeah.
I have these from 4 years ago because they're beautiful and because they're really nice. But I think that, this is going to actually tie right into the other talk you're giving, which is all about taking pictures of mushrooms. Right. Because you obviously, half the reason I picked these up is because they had beautiful pictures of tomatoes on them. And the cool thing about mushrooms is they're so pretty. And so if you can take some beautiful pictures of mushrooms, people will pick that up just because it's a pretty picture of a mushroom, take it home, remember you for the rest of, a very long time.
Yeah, that's right. It has a lot to do with the beauty and the memory. I have people ask me all the time, like, do I need to include a photo? I'm like, you don't have to, but I really, really would. Because it's just like someone seeing your face when you're introduced to, and your face is there. They remember you and they're going to remember your business and what your business produces if you have that image. Yeah,
absolutely.
So more ideas, your weekly newsletters that go out that you're sending to customers and clientele, of course, or monthly, however you're sending them, whether it's print, whether it's digital, have those recipes in there. And then local media is another great option. So most even smaller town newspapers are looking for recipes that they can share in their publications. So you can reach out, you can get, more traction for your particular business, but then also be serving them with a recipe that they have to share. And another thing that can be a really great idea is local talent. So small and large news stations have individuals that will come on. I have a lot of friends in food who do this. They'll come on and cook for the week, or they have a weekly segment or something like that. And they're dietitians or even food bloggers, and they will, come on and cook recipes. And sometimes they're looking for recipes to share and people to partner with. So reach out to local media, see if they will, on their next segment, if they will cook a mushroom recipe, tell them you'll provide them with the recipe and the mushrooms for it. Those kind of partnerships can be really great. And another reason why it's really a good idea to turn all those ideas you have into something that's, shows people how to use the mushrooms. And then talking just a little bit about social media posts. Definitely you want to take, if you have those images, whether it's those tomato images that are just general tomato images, or they are an image of the finished recipe, the best method is, of course, publishing it on your website. It could be a blog post first so that you can then send people back to your website or the site where you're selling your mushrooms, or where people can find you if you're at a market or something like that. That is the best method. So you would then share those images on there, then they would come back to your website for that recipe. Now, it definitely doesn't hurt to occasionally, for short recipes, just to kind of entice people and bring them in, you can put those in, say, an Instagram post. You can put those in the caption of the Instagram post to share with people. But I think overall, the idea is really to get people back to you and where they can buy those mushrooms from you. Well, that's all I had to cover with the ideas for recipes. Just information up here on where you can find me. But Michael, I don't know if you have any final questions for me, but.
Yeah, Lori, that was great. You know, and it's really interesting because I don't get in the kitchen an awful lot. My wife's a wonderful cook and she does a very good job of, but I do get in there once in a while, and there is a difference in the recipes out there. A lot of the things you just talked about, I realized, oh, that's why I failed at that recipe, or that's why that one was frustrating to me, because it wasn't laid out properly. So thinking about all the things that you talked about really allows people to make, you know, crystal clear recipes that their customers are going to love, and then are going to increase the sales of their products. I get one other thing I think too to bring out is, if you are creating recipes for your customers, see if you can work with somebody else. Let's say if you're at a farmer's market or another local producer, to try to tie in. Like, you're producing the mushrooms, there's someone that can make bread that you could use as an ingredient so that you can feature somebody else.
Yeah, that is a really great idea. That's a great idea.
So just yeah, increasing it that way. Lori, what would you say your favorite mushroom recipe is?
Let's see, favorite mushroom recipe. So I have one, and it actually, I've got a picture of it in the photography presentation, but I created a wild rice recipe. I believe we used walnuts and maitake mushrooms in it, because maitakes are my favorite. And it's just a really simple stir fry kind of recipe. It's actually on the Mushroom Council site, and it's really great for this time of year and holidays and things like that. But that's probably my favorite. I really like simple, you know, applications when it comes to mushrooms, because it really brings out their flavors.
Absolutely. Well, we will link to that recipe from their website below, so people can go find that right away.
Yeah, it sounds
great.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today and chatting all about mushroom and creating recipes.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been great to be here.